The moment the world had been holding its breath for has finally arrived. A grand and high-profile reception took place in Islamabad as the Iranian delegation reached Pakistan. The atmosphere was marked by formality, symbolism, and strong diplomatic presence, reflecting the significance of the visit. The Iranian delegation includes Iran's Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf and Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, who are leading the discussions at this critical time. On the Pakistani side, several top officials were present to receive the delegation. Among them were Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Mohammad Ishaq Dar, Chief of Army Staff General Asim Munir, National Assembly Speaker Sardar Ayaz Sadiq, and Interior Minister Syed Mohsen Naqvi. Their presence highlighted the importance Pakistan is giving to this diplomatic engagement. The visuals clearly showed a carefully coordinated state-level welcome, signaling the seriousness of the ongoing discussions. Before arriving in Islamabad, Iranian Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf shared a deeply emotional image that quickly gained attention. The image showed the interior of his aircraft, where each seat had a photograph placed on it. These were pictures of children, specifically those from a school in Minab. According to the narrative shared, these images represent children who were killed in a tragic incident when a school in Minab was attacked, resulting in the deaths of around 160 children. The emotional symbolism behind these images was intended to highlight Iran's human perspective and the grief it carries into diplomatic negotiations. The message being conveyed by Iran through these visuals is that it is approaching the talks not only with political objectives, but also with a strong humanitarian sentiment. It is presenting itself as a nation deeply affected by past tragedies and determined to bring attention to civilian suffering on the global stage. This emotional framing appears to be part of its broader diplomatic messaging strategy as it enters negotiations in Islamabad. Meanwhile, breaking developments indicate that U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance has also arrived in Islamabad. His arrival adds another major dimension to the already high-stakes diplomatic activity taking place in the city. Visuals circulating on television screens show J.D. Vance reaching Pakistan along with a senior American negotiation team. This delegation reportedly includes key figures such as Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, who are part of the broader U.S. diplomatic and negotiation structure. The arrival of the American delegation marks another significant layer in these discussions, making Islamabad the central hub of multiple overlapping diplomatic engagements. Pakistan is being positioned as a mediator and host for high-level negotiations, playing what officials describe as a facilitative role in encouraging dialogue between major international actors. At the same time, political commentary surrounding the situation highlights contrasting narratives. On one hand, Iran is projecting a humanitarian image, emphasizing its losses and the suffering of children. On the other hand, discussions also reflect criticism of U.S. foreign policy and strategic positioning, with sharp rhetoric being exchanged in political and media discourse. This sets the stage for what many are calling a historic diplomatic moment in Islamabad, where multiple global powers and regional stakeholders are converging at a critical point of tension and negotiation. The outcome of these engagements remains uncertain, but the level of participation clearly indicates the importance of the discussions taking place. As the diplomatic activity intensified in Islamabad, parallel political statements and global reactions continued to shape the narrative around these developments. Reports being broadcast and circulated referenced statements attributed to former U.S. President Donald Trump, which reflected a highly aggressive and confident tone regarding recent military and strategic actions. In those remarks, he was quoted as saying that naval capabilities had been struck, rocket systems had been destroyed, and key leadership structures had already been eliminated, suggesting that victory had effectively been achieved in advance, according to his perspective. These statements added further tension to an already highly sensitive geopolitical environment. At the same time, commentary from regional leadership also added weight to the seriousness of the ongoing discussions. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif was referenced as describing the talks as make or break, emphasizing that the outcome of these negotiations could go in either direction depending on how discussions unfold. The framing of the dialogue highlighted uncertainty, while also reinforcing the idea that multiple parties are deeply invested in ensuring a productive outcome. Pakistan's role as host was again emphasized, portraying the country as a central venue for diplomacy, where difficult conversations are being facilitated. Alongside these developments, media reports also highlighted statements from the White House suggesting that Iran has no cards left, a phrase that quickly became part of the wider political discourse. This characterization was met with a strong reaction from Iranian representatives. The Iranian embassy issued a response describing these claims as part of psychological warfare attempts against Iran, rejecting the framing and asserting that Iran is experienced and resilient in dealing with such narratives. The tone of the response was firm, reflecting Iran's position that it will not be influenced by psychological or informational pressure campaigns. In addition to these exchanges, Iran's parliament speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf also issued statements outlining specific conditions related to the negotiation process. According to his remarks, certain previously agreed steps between the involved parties had not yet been implemented. Among these were a ceasefire arrangement in Lebanon and the release of frozen Iranian assets prior to the start of formal negotiations. He emphasized that these conditions were essential prerequisites, indicating that meaningful dialogue would only proceed if these terms were addressed. This position introduced further complexity into the already delicate diplomatic situation, as it placed clear expectations on the negotiating framework before substantive talks could fully begin. Meanwhile, reports indicated that both Iranian officials and other international delegations were arriving in Islamabad, signaling that discussions were still expected to proceed despite unresolved conditions. At the same time, developments from the Middle East continued to escalate. News reports referenced an airstrike on a government building in southern Lebanon's Nabatea region, which reportedly resulted in the deaths of at least 13 members of a state security agency. This incident further intensified regional tensions, adding urgency to calls for diplomatic engagement. Lebanese authorities confirmed the casualties, while regional reactions pointed to a rapidly deteriorating security situation. In response, Israeli leadership also made statements indicating a willingness to engage in dialogue with Lebanon under certain circumstances. However, at the same time, strong rhetoric continued from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who reiterated a firm stance against negotiations with Hezbollah. These conflicting signals reflected the broader instability in the region, where military actions and diplomatic messaging were occurring simultaneously. Amid these developments, discussions also emerged about the possibility of U.S.-facilitated talks between Israel and Lebanon in the coming week. While details remained uncertain, the suggestion of American involvement added another layer to the already complex diplomatic environment. The situation underscored the United States' continued role as an intermediary in regional conflicts, despite criticism and competing narratives surrounding its influence. As these events unfolded, the focus remained on Islamabad, where multiple delegations were converging. The overlapping crises, statements, and negotiations created a highly charged atmosphere in which diplomacy, military developments, and political messaging were all intersecting at once, setting the stage for an uncertain and critical phase ahead. Trico, paragraph 3, U.S. English, timestamps removed, narration corrected. As the situation continued to develop, attention shifted back to the broader regional and global implications of the ongoing conflict and diplomatic efforts. Reports highlighted continued escalation on the ground in Lebanon and Israel, where military actions and retaliatory strikes were intensifying. Hezbollah, according to various media reports, continued to carry out attacks on Israeli positions, including military bases and strategic installations. Footage circulating in media coverage showed missile preparations and coordinated operations, though specific operational details remained unverified by independent sources. In response, Israeli forces also continued their operations across multiple areas, with ongoing strikes reported in southern Lebanon. These actions contributed to a rapidly deteriorating security environment, where civilian areas and military targets were increasingly affected. The cycle of attacks and counterattacks underscored the volatility of the conflict, with both sides maintaining aggressive postures and limited signs of de-escalation. Israeli leadership, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, maintained a firm stance, repeatedly stating that there would be no negotiations with Hezbollah under current conditions. At the same time, reports suggested that international actors, including the United States, were exploring the possibility of facilitating indirect discussions between Lebanon and Israel. This dual-track approach, military escalation alongside diplomatic maneuvering, reflected the complexity of the situation where war and negotiation were unfolding simultaneously. Meanwhile, in Pakistan, the presence of Iranian and American delegations in Islamabad continued to draw global attention. The country's role as a host for high-level diplomatic engagement placed it at the center of a sensitive geopolitical moment. Officials in Pakistan were seen facilitating discussions and ensuring security arrangements for all visiting delegations. The gathering of such high-profile representatives underscored the importance of Pakistan's diplomatic positioning as a mediator and logistical hub for international talks. At the same time, political narratives surrounding Iran's global position were also being debated internationally. Some commentators and analysts suggested that Iran's resistance against both the United States and Israel had strengthened its symbolic standing, particularly among its supporters. This perspective emphasized Iran's ability to withstand pressure despite economic sanctions, military threats, and diplomatic isolation attempts. On the other hand, critics pointed out that Iran has also faced significant military and strategic challenges, highlighting the uneven nature of the conflict and the broader power imbalance in the region. Public sentiment within Iran was also portrayed in media coverage, showing demonstrations and gatherings in various cities. Supporters of the government were seen expressing solidarity and emphasizing national unity. These public displays were often framed as evidence of internal cohesion and political resilience, particularly during periods of heightened external pressure. Iranian leadership has frequently pointed to such mobilization as a sign of national strength and unity in the face of foreign opposition. At the diplomatic level, Iran's leadership continued to assert its conditions for meaningful negotiations, reinforcing earlier statements regarding ceasefire arrangements and the release of frozen assets. These demands remained central to Iran's negotiating position, indicating that any potential agreement would require significant concessions from opposing parties. The persistence of these conditions suggested that the path toward a resolution remained complex and uncertain. In Europe and other regions, political voices also began to react more strongly to the unfolding situation. Some European leaders criticized the humanitarian impact of ongoing military operations, particularly in Lebanon, calling for restraint and adherence to international law. These statements added further international pressure on the parties involved, highlighting growing global concern over the humanitarian consequences of the conflict. Overall, the situation remained highly unstable, with multiple crises unfolding at the same time: military escalation in Lebanon and Israel, high-stakes diplomacy in Islamabad, and ongoing political messaging from global powers. Each development influenced the other, creating a deeply interconnected geopolitical environment. As negotiations continued and tensions persisted, the world remained watchful, waiting to see whether diplomacy could succeed in preventing further escalation or whether the situation would continue to deteriorate. As these interconnected developments continue to unfold, the broader geopolitical landscape remains deeply uncertain, with multiple regions experiencing simultaneous pressure from both diplomatic negotiations and ongoing security tensions. The situation centered around Islamabad has now evolved into more than just a bilateral or trilateral discussion. It has effectively become a convergence point for competing global interests, regional rivalries, and strategic messaging from all involved parties. The presence of high-level delegations from Iran, the United States, and other stakeholders has turned the diplomatic environment into a highly sensitive arena where every statement, gesture, and condition carries significant political weight. Pakistan's role in this context has become increasingly important as it positions itself as a facilitator of dialogue at a time when trust between many of the involved actors remains fragile. Hosting such high-profile delegations requires not only logistical coordination but also diplomatic balancing, as each side arrives with firm positions and deeply rooted concerns. Pakistani officials continue to emphasize dialogue, stability, and de-escalation as core objectives, while also managing the pressures that come with being at the center of such a complex international engagement. Meanwhile, the wider regional conflict involving Lebanon, Israel, and non-state armed groups continues to influence the tone and urgency of negotiations. Military developments on the ground, including ongoing strikes, retaliatory actions, and shifting front lines, are shaping the negotiating positions of all involved parties. Each escalation tends to harden rhetoric, making diplomatic compromise more difficult, while each pause in violence creates temporary openings for dialogue. This constant push and pull between conflict and negotiation has created a highly unstable equilibrium. International observers have increasingly expressed concern over the humanitarian consequences of the ongoing hostilities. Reports of civilian casualties, infrastructure damage, and displacement continue to emerge from affected areas, particularly in southern Lebanon. These developments have intensified calls from various governments and organizations for restraint and adherence to international humanitarian law. At the same time, political divisions within the international community remain evident, with some states strongly supporting one side, while others call for immediate ceasefire measures and broader negotiations. Within this complex environment, the narrative battle between different political actors has also become a defining feature of the crisis. Each side continues to present its own version of events, emphasizing strategic success, moral justification, or defensive necessity. This information competition plays out across global media platforms, shaping public perception and influencing diplomatic momentum. Statements made by leaders, embassies, and official spokespersons are rapidly amplified, often becoming central talking points in international debate. Despite these challenges, diplomatic engagement in Islamabad represents a rare attempt to bring multiple stakeholders into a structured conversation at the same time. Whether this effort will lead to tangible breakthroughs remains uncertain, but the very fact that such discussions are taking place indicates that channels of communication are still open. In conflicts of this scale and complexity, even limited dialogue can sometimes serve as a foundation for future de-escalation, provided that trust can be gradually built and maintained. At this stage, the situation remains fluid. No final agreements have been announced, and key disagreements over conditions, timelines, and responsibilities continue to persist. However, the continuation of talks itself suggests that none of the major actors are currently willing to completely abandon the diplomatic track. Instead, they appear to be testing each other's positions while simultaneously managing pressure on the ground. Ultimately, the coming days will be critical in determining whether the current diplomatic push in Islamabad can translate into meaningful progress, or whether it will become another stalled attempt in a long series of unresolved negotiations. For now, the world continues to watch closely as regional tensions, global politics, and diplomatic efforts remain tightly interwoven in a situation that is still far from resolution.